Good morning. Bonjour. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à notre symposium Célébrer Voltaire. Welcome and good morning to this wonderful day of celebration and of intellectual stimulation. My name is Chris Lyons. I'm also a librarian, and I'm delighted to have you here today. You should have with you a program that was given out. If not, you could get one. And there's also, you might be interested to read something about the future of the library. This is Fiat Lux, a brave reconceptualization of the library for the 21st century, which you might very much find intriguing. I'd like to just tell you that the proceedings are being recorded today, including the questions. So we hope you're all comfortable with that. And I'd like right now to invite Dr. Colleen Cook, the Trenholme Dean of Libraries and Archives, to open the proceedings.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all of you for being here. By the way, Chris is a librarian, but he's also the Osler librarian, and he is a rare book specialist in our wonderful medical library collection, which is a very, very unusual collection as well. And I invite anyone who's interested also to visit up there. So, bonjour and bienvenue à McGill. Thank you for coming to this wonderful event as we celebrate the life and legacy of Voltaire, whose zealous writings on being human and fighting for one's individual rights are as relevant today as ever. Before we get started, I would like to thank the individuals whose generosity and hard work have helped make this day possible. They always make me, who just stands up here and have fun, look really good. The impetus for this event was the acquisition of the J. Patrick Lee Voltaire collection, which wouldn't have been possible without the incredible support of our many generous donors, both here at McGill and the larger McGill family. In particular, Ethel Groffier provided invaluable support for this project. Professor Lee put together a great collection, and we're thrilled to have it here at McGill. Thank you to Richard Virr, head of Rare Books and Special Collections, who was the driving force behind the acquisition of the collection. I also want to thank our catalogers in collection services in the McGill library system. They have been expeditious and incredibly hardworking in cataloging the very large Lee Voltaire collection and our other Voltaire acquisitions made since 2013. This material is often difficult, with false imprints, piracies, and other ambiguities, as many of you know. The records that have been produced are a model of modern cataloging and are essential in making collections such as this accessible to scholars and students and those interested around the world. Thank you especially to my assistant, Bruna Ceccolini, an organizer extraordinaire, without whom this event and events for the past 40 years would never have happened. 45 years, excuse me. I don't want to minimize her contributions. Thank you to all of our speakers who have come from near and far to share their knowledge with us. I'd also like to point out that there's an exhibition in the entry in the foyer of the McLennan Library, which is just across the street, basically at that angle, of materials from the Patrick Lee Voltaire collection and other of our Voltaire materials. And we invite you, please, to go take a peek at it. That's how we teach with our rare collections, is to do exhibitions like that, as well as symposia such as this one. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming together with us as we celebrate Voltaire and the acquisition of the J. Patrick Lee collection. Have a wonderful and enlightening day. Thank you very much.
It almost seems superfluous to have to introduce our first speaker, but a tradition requires it. So it is my great pleasure to start the conference proceedings by introducing Dr. Richard Virr, who's head of Curator of Manuscripts at Rare Books and Special Collections, McGill University Library and Archives. He holds a doctorate in church history from McGill and is a founding member of the Groupe de Recherche Multidisciplinaire de Montréal sur les livres anciens. The group's current 4-year project is the preparation of the Catalogue raisonné pour les livres d'art du 15e and 16e siècle conservés au Québec. This project is funded by the Social Science and Humanity Research Council of Canada. So thank you, taxpayers. Dr. Virr's talk is entitled Visiting Voltaire, Gibbon, Boswell, Burney, and Hume. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions after his presentation. Dr. Virr?
Thank you, Chris. It's a great pleasure to open our proceedings today with visiting Voltaire. Voltaire was a celebrity and a figure of controversy and of fascination in the 18th century. In the 21st century, he remains someone who still fascinates and about whom there is still debate and controversy. As we begin our symposium celebrating Voltaire, it seems appropriate to start with some consideration of a few selected 18th century accounts of the man. In the third quarter of the 18th century, 2 Scots and 2 Englishmen had encounters with Voltaire. These were Edward Gibbon, James Boswell, Charles Burney, and David Hume. Their meetings with Voltaire were not unique, and indeed were probably fairly typical of such encounters. Their descriptions of their visits reveal a great deal about themselves and about Voltaire. These visits are the subject of this paper. However, before proceeding to discuss their visits to Voltaire, it seems logical to begin by visiting Voltaire at the McGill University Library. The acquisition of the J. Patrick Lee Voltaire collection in 2013 dramatically changed McGill's Voltaire holdings. While McGill has had for some time major 18th century holdings, Voltaire was the one significant gap. It was not that McGill did not have editions of Voltaire. On the contrary, there were some important holdings of 18th century editions of his works, but not to the same extent as for some of his contemporaries, such as David Hume and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. McGill, since the late 1940s, has built an important David Hume collection, and since the late 1990s, this has become a comprehensive collection of 18th century and later editions of Hume's own writings, translations of them, and also commentaries, refutations, and other engagements with his thought. Where there is Hume, one usually finds Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and that is the case at McGill, where there is an extensive Rousseau collection, one, like the Hume collection, that has real strengths in 18th century editions and translations and commentaries. It is to these holdings that the Lee Voltaire collection adds in a significant way. The original description of the collection, prepared by Louise Lee, reads as follows. This collection of printed books and a few handwritten manuscripts was collected over some 40 years by J. Patrick Lee. The collection includes 1,994 items representing 3,189 volumes. There are 851 items by Voltaire. These include some 245 editions of Candide, 39 editions of Zadig, not counting those listed under Les Contes et Romans, and there are 54 editions of the Dictionnaire philosophique and 21 editions of l'Henriade. And there are 34 manuscripts, including 13 autograph letters of Voltaire and others. The most important manuscript is undoubtedly the Recueil de Poésie, compiled by Madame du Châtelet, Voltaire's companion of many years. The depth of Voltaire holdings in the Lee collection has has meant it has been possible to add other Voltaire additions to the library holdings in an informed and purposeful manner. And just this morning I ordered another edition of Voltaire, one of his plays, in an English, not very well-known English translation from the late 18th century. The other half of the Lee collection consists of works by other, primarily French authors of the 18th century. In all, there are some 1,108 items from the 18th century in the Lee collection, and approximately half are by Voltaire. This was, in fact, one of the attractions of the Lee collection. McGill has collections of great depth for certain French authors of the period, including Crébillon fils, Louis-Sébastien Mercier, Restif de la Bretonne, and Madame de Greffigny. To these, the Lee collection adds works of many other lesser-known figures. Finally, it is worth noting that the recent acquisition of the remaining portion of the rare book collection of the Presbyterian College, Montreal, the first portions were acquired in the 1980s, has added an important group of 18th century French Protestant materials to the holdings of rare books and special collections. While here we have been considering materials primarily in the humanities, it is also worth noting that McGill has other 18th century holdings, particularly in the sciences, in the Osler Library for the History of Medicine, and in the Blackerwood Natural History Collection. Finally, before encountering our 18th century visitors to Voltaire, I would like to say a few words about J. Patrick Lee himself. Born in Litchfield, Kentucky in 1942, Lee first attended Brescia College at Owensville, Kentucky, and later Fordham University in New York City, where he received his PhD in 1971. His dissertation was entitled Voltaire's Sermon des Cinquante, a critical edition. His academic career included a number of colleges and universities in the United States, but his long association was with Berry University in Miami Shores, Florida, which began in 1981. He was professor of French and later served as vice president for academic affairs. He was provost and senior vice president at the time of his death. During all these years, he was giving conference papers on various aspects of his research on Voltaire and contributing regularly to various scholarly journals. He was well known both nationally and internationally for this work and had cooperated with various publications with the Voltaire Foundation. He was also an avid collector of books, particularly, as we have seen, related to Voltaire in the 18th century, and had built a large personal library of some 11,000 volumes. The Lee Voltaire collection that had been acquired by McGill was a part of this assemblage. One notable thing about Lee's collection is the number of United States imprints of works by Voltaire. It is my understanding that Lee had hoped to do significant work on this subject. One final note, and that is to say that just before his death in the summer of 2006, Lee had been in Montreal in April for a conference of the American Society for 18th Century Studies, where he gave a paper, The English Translation of Voltaire's La Pucelle. It is perhaps appropriate then that his collection, the fruits of long years of collecting, should find a home at McGill. Now let us turn our attention to our 18th century visitors. Voltaire was, of course, undoubtedly the greatest celebrity of the period. He was the one sight that any informed traveler undertaking the grand tour would want to check off his list of things to do and see. Voltaire also attracted those who wanted to discuss or argue with him, seek out his counsel, or hang out with a celebrity. Our visitors manifest many of these characteristics. Voltaire prided himself on being the innkeeper of Europe and had, by the end of his life, welcomed over 500 British visitors. The first of our visitors is Edward Gibbon, was born in 1737 and died in 1794, the historian of the Roman Empire. He met Voltaire while a student at Lausanne in the household of the Calvinist pastor Daniel Pavillard in the years 1753 to 1758. Gibbon had been sent to Switzerland by his father after a disastrous 14 months at Magdalen College, Oxford, and his precipitous reception into the Roman Catholic Church. Pastor Pavillard, Gibbon wrote, was to prove to be a wise and sympathetic teacher who trusted Gibbon's, intellectual honesty to reason his way back to the Protestant way of thinking, and once he had mastered the French language, the best works of the Enlightenment were open to him. Gibbon was 16 when he arrived at Lausanne, and it was there that his true intellectual formation took place. He left the Pavillard family grounded in Latin with Tacitus as a model, and had read Bayle, Montesquieu, and Pascal, all of whom were to influence Gibbon's writing. It was also during these years that he began to enjoy society and the French theater. 30 years later, he was to write, "Such as I am in genius or in learning or in manners, I owe my creation to Lausanne." He was later to return to Lausanne to live in 1783 and was to remain there for 10 years before returning to England a few months before his death in early 1794. Voltaire, after his falling out with Frederick the Great and his departure from Potsdam in 1753, settled in Geneva and later at Lausanne. It was there that Gibbon met him and frequented his household in 1757 and 1758. Gibbon records his encounter with the most extraordinary man of the age in his memoirs. He writes, "Before I was recalled from Switzerland, I had the satisfaction of seeing the most extraordinary man of the age, a poet, a historian, a philosopher, who had filled 30 quartos of prose and verse with his various productions, often excellent and often entertaining. Need I add the name Voltaire? After forfeiting by his own misconduct the friendship of the first of kings, he retired at the age of 60 with a plentiful fortune to a free and beautiful country and resided there 2 winters, 1757 and 1758, in the town or the neighborhood of Lausanne. My desire of beholding Voltaire, whom then I rated above his real magnitude, was easily gratified. He received me with civility as an English youth, but I cannot boast of any peculiar notice or distinction." The highest gratification that I derived from Voltaire's residence at Lausanne was the uncommon circumstance of hearing a great poet disclaim his own productions on the stage. He had formed a troupe of gentlemen and ladies, some of whom were not destitute of talent. A decent theater was framed at Montrepos, a country house at the end of a suburb. Dress and scenes were provided at the expense of the actors, and the author directed rehearsals with zeal and attention of paternal love. In 2 successive winters, his tragedies Zaire, Alzire, and Zulime, and his sentimental comedy, The Enfant Prodige, were played at the theater of Montrepos. But it was not without reluctance and ill humor that the envious bard allowed the representation of the Iphigenie of Racine. The parts of the young and fair were distorted by the fat and ugly niece, Madame Denis, who could not, like our admirable Pritchard, make spectators forget the defects of her age and person. For himself, Voltaire reserved the characters best adapted to his years, such as Lusignan. His declamation was fashioned to the pomp and cadence of the old stage, and he expressed the enthusiasm of poetry rather than the feeling of nature. My ardor, which soon became conspicuous, seldom failed of procuring me a ticket. The habits of pleasure fortified my taste for the French theater, and that taste has perhaps abated my idolatry for the gigantic genius of Shakespeare, which is inculcated from our infancy as the first duty of Englishmen. The wit and philosophy of Voltaire, his table and theater refined in a visible degree the manners of Lausanne, and however addicted to study, I enjoyed my share of the amusements of society. After the representations of Mon Repos, I sometimes supped with the actors. I was now familiar in some and acquainted in many houses, and my evenings were generally devoted to cards and conversation, either in private parties or numerous assemblies. It is interesting to see Gibbon recording his meeting with Voltaire as a part of his everyday activities. The most extraordinary man of the age was soon just part of the daily round. But then, Gibbon was a teenager, and no matter how extraordinary Voltaire was, he probably found it more fun having dinner with the actors. This account appeared in the posthumously published edition of Gibbon's miscellaneous works with memoirs of his life and writings, prepared for publication in 1796 by his longtime friend, John Lord Sheffield. It was during a visit to Lord Sheffield that Gibbon died in January of 1795. The memoirs were popular, and this account also appeared in the July 1796 number of the Universal magazine, where I just recently came across it as I was preparing this paper using other direct reference from the memoirs, as did other extracts from the same source. Gibbon had in his library two complete sets of Voltaire's works, the 30-volume Geneva edition of 1768-77, hence probably the reference to the 30 volumes quarto in the memoirs, and the 57-volume edition of Lausanne. He also had an edition of Voltaire's correspondence and English translations of the History of the War of 1741, a London edition of the Siècle de Louis XIV, and also an Amsterdam edition of Memoirs écrits par lui-même. All of this is recorded in the catalog of Gibbon's library. James Boswell, who's our next visitor, who was born in 1740 and also died in 1795, is probably best known today for his biography of his friend Samuel Johnson. But he has also left posterity a copious journal with details of his struggles with doubt, sex, religious doubt, and insecurity. In 1763, Boswell went to Utrecht to continue his legal studies. Both Dutch and Scots law were based on Roman law, and it was not unusual for aspiring young Scot lawyers to pursue their education in Holland. After an unhappy winter there in Utrecht, Boswell set out on his long-hoped-for grand tour in June 1764. He spent the summer and fall visiting Germany, and in November he was at Moitié, seeking to make Jean-Jacques Rousseau his confessor and spiritual director. Jean-Jacques wisely declined. By December, Boswell had arrived in Switzerland and was approaching close to that other of his main objectives, Voltaire. He was both attracted and repelled by Voltaire. He was attracted by this scourge of obscurantism and of the grand ideas which his name recalled. But he was also repelled by his deism, the infidel, the author of so many deitistical pieces. Boswell recounts his first meeting with Voltaire in his journal as follows. Monday, 24 December, this is in 1764. After calling on my bankers, I took a coach to Ferney, the seat of the illustrious Monsieur de Voltaire. I was in true spirits. The earth was covered with snow. I surveyed wild nature with a noble eye. I called up all the grand ideas which I have ever entertained of Voltaire. And I just might, in parentheses, say, if you know Boswell at all, this is so typical of his attitude and just of him coming through in his account here. The first object that struck me was his church with this inscription, Deo erexit Voltaire, 1761. His chateau was handsome. I was received by 2 or 3 footmen who showed me into a very elegant room. I sent by one of them a letter to Monsieur de Voltaire, which I had from Colonel Constant at The Hague. He returned and told me, Monsieur de Voltaire is very much annoyed at being disturbed. He is abed. I was afraid that I should not see him. Some ladies and gentlemen entered, and I was entertained for some time. At last, Monsieur de Voltaire opened the door of his apartment and stepped forth. I surveyed him with eager attention and found him just as his print had made me conceive him. He received me with dignity and the air of the world that a Frenchman acquires in such perfection. He had a slate blue, fine frieze greatcoat nightgown and a three-knotted wig. He sat erect upon his chair and simpered when he spoke. He was not in spirits, nor was I. All I presented was the foolish face of wandering praise. Here he's quoting Alexander Pope. We talked of Scotland. He said that Glasgow editions were très belles. I said an academy of painting was also established there, but did not succeed. Our Scotland is no country for that. He replied with a keen archness, no, to paint well, it is necessary to have warm feet. It is hard to paint when your feet are cold. Another would have given a long dissertation on the coldness of our climate. Monsieur Voltaire gave the very essence of rarely in a half dozen words. I mentioned the severe criticism which the Gazette Littéraire had given upon Lord Kame's Elements. I imagined that it was done by Voltaire, but would not ask him. He repeated me several of the bon mots in it with an air that confirmed my idea of his having written the criticism. He called my lord always Sir Monsieur Kames. I told him that Mr. Johnson and I intended to make a tour through the Hebrides, the Northern Islands of Scotland. He smiled and cried, very well, but I remain here. You will allow me to stay here? Certainly. Well, then go. I have no objection at all. I asked him if he still spoke English. He replied, no. To speak English, one must place the tongue between the teeth, and I have lost all my teeth. He was curious to hear anecdotes of Berlin. He asked me who was our minister there. I said we only had a chargé d'affaires. Ah, he said, un chargé d'affaires n'est guère chargé. He said Hume was a true philosopher. As we talked, there entered Père Adam, a French Jesuit who was protected in the house of Voltaire. What a curious idea. He was a lively old man with white hair. Voltaire cried in English, there, sir, is a young man, a scholar who is learning your language, a broken soldier from the company of Jesus. Ah, said Père Adam, a young man of 60. Monsieur Voltaire did not dine with us. Madame Denis, his niece, does the honor of his house very well. She understands English. She was remarkably good to me. I sat by her and talked much. We talked much. I became lively and most agreeable. Again, a very typical Boswellian sentiment. We had a company of about 12. The family consists of 7. The niece of the great Corneille lives here. She is married to Monsieur Dupuis. The gates of Geneva shut at 5, so I was obliged to hasten away after dinner without seeing any more of Monsieur de Voltaire. Thus Boswell's first visit to Voltaire, and he wanted to see him again. A letter the following day to Madame Denis soliciting an overnight stay, obviously with the approbation of Voltaire himself, the permission was granted, and Voltaire arrived for his second visit at Ferney on the 27th of December and stayed until the 29th. To his friend William Temple, he sent a long letter detailing Voltaire's conversation. Boswell's most recent biographer, Robert Zaretsky, summarizes their encounter thus. Boswell wanted to get to the bottom of Voltaire's soul. He was determined to know the philosopher's sincere belief on the matter of belief. Demanding from Voltaire an honest confession of his true sentiments, Boswell got what he desired, but not what he had hoped. Voltaire confessed his love of the Supreme Being and his entire resignation to the will of him who is all-wise. Moreover, his host expressed his desire to resemble the author of goodness by being good himself. In a word, Boswell got the world according to deism. For Boswell, it is reasonably plain that the basis of his faith was not reason, but the combination of a more or less permanent sense of guilt with a very lively fear of death. No amount of conversation with Voltaire could or would change this. Boswell concluded the account of his visits, writing in his journal, "I departed from this chateau in a most extraordinary humor, thinking hard and wondering if I could possibly, when again in Scotland, again feel my most childish prejudices." Boswell was boisterous, loquacious, bumptious, and irrepressible. In life, probably insupportable, but now in his journals and under other writings, the best of companions. I expect the Voltaire and his household were glad to see him leave. Charles Burney, the musician and music historian and the father of the novelist Francis Burney, was another traveler who had the opportunity of meeting Voltaire, and he left a vivid impression of that meeting. Burney had conceived the idea of writing a history of music, and to do so he undertook 2 tours of Europe, the first to France and Italy in 1770, and the second to Germany and Austria in 1772. The published versions of the tours provide invaluable information on the state of music on the continent during these years, and provided much of the information for Burney's General History of Music, which began publication in 1776. Burney left England on the 5th of June in 1770, and it was during the first part of his tour to France and Italy that on arrival in Geneva, a chance meeting with Voltaire took place. Percy Scholes, Burney's mid-20th century biographer, provides a long extract from a holograph manuscript in his possession that describes the meeting. Burney drove out to Ferney and was shown over the house and grounds, Scholes writes. Just as he was getting into his chaise again, he saw the great man. He approached the place where I stood, Burney writes, where I stood motionless, in order to contemplate his person as much as I could when his eyes turned from me. But on seeing him move towards me, I found myself drawn by some irresistible power towards him, and without knowing what I did, I sensibly met him halfway. It is not easy to conceive it possible to live, for life to subsist in a form so nearly composed of mere skin and bone as that of Monsieur Voltaire. He complained of decrepitude and said he supposed I was curious to form an idea of the figure of one walking after death. However, his eyes and his whole countenance are still full of fire, and though emaciated, a more lively expression cannot be imagined. He inquired after English news and observed that poetical squabbles had given way to political ones, but seemed to think that the spirit of opposition is necessary in poetry as in politics. Les querelles d'auteur sont les biens de la littérature, comme dans un gouvernement libre, les querelles des grands et les clameurs des petits sont nécessaires à la liberté. And he added, when critics are silent, it does not so much prove age to be correct as dull. He inquired what poets we had now. I told him we had Mason and Gray. They write but little, said he, and you seem to have no one who lords it over the rest like Dryden, Pope, and Swift. I told him that it was one of the inconveniences of periodical journals, however well executed, that they often silenced modest men of genius, while imprudent blockheads were impenetrable and unable to feel the critic's scourge, that Mr. Gray and Mr. Mason had both been illiberally treated by mechanical critics, even in newspapers, and added that modesty and love of quiet seems in these gentlemen to have got the better of their love of fame. During this conversation, we approached the buildings that he was constructing near the road to the chateau. These, he said, pointing to them, are the most innocent and perhaps the most useful of all my works. I observed that he had many other works which were of far more extensive use and would be much more durable than these. He was obliging to show me farmhouses that he had built and the plans of others, after which I took my leave for fear of breaking upon his time, being unwilling to rob the public of things so precious as the few remaining moments of this great and universal genius. Clearly, Voltaire was ready to welcome the casual visitor, and in command, too, of current English literary life. What is interesting in this report is the importance Voltaire attaches to his buildings. They are more than mere structures. They are the foundation stones of community building, as Roger Pearson has suggested in his 2005 biography of Voltaire. Burney had the unexpected opportunity to meet Voltaire. His original intention had been to gaze upon the place. And now, what of the Scottish philosopher David Hume? Did he too meet Voltaire? In fact, the two men never met, although the opportunity was there when Hume was in Paris as the secretary to the British ambassador to France, the Earl of Hertford, between October 1763 and January 1766. Hume moved in the circles that would have made a meeting possible, frequenting the salons of the Baron de Holbach and others where he met many of the philosophes. He became particularly close to Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, with whom he planned a trip to Italy. During Hume's Paris years, Voltaire was installed at Geneva. Despite not having met, the two did exchange letters. On the 9th of January 1764, Hume wrote from Paris to Colonel James Edmonstone describing how he had been offered the secretaryship, and then writes, "When I arrived here, all Monsieur Voltaire's friends told me of the regard he always expressed for me, that some advances on my part were due to his age and would be well taken. I accordingly wrote him a letter in which I expressed the esteem which are undoubtedly due to his talents, and other things I said that if he were not, and among other things I said that if I were not confined to Paris by public business, I should have a great ambition to pay him a visit at Geneva. This is the foundation of the report you mentioned, but I am absolutely confined to Paris and the court, and cannot on any account leave them so much as for 3 days." This sounds a bit disingenuous. Did Hume really not want to meet his esteemed admirer? We will probably never know. Hume's letter to Voltaire has not survived. However, only recently, in 2006, the reply from Voltaire came to light. He wrote in English on the 12th of November 1763 from Geneva, "I have been your admirer since I read your work, and I was your friend in my heart. These sentiments are due to one who in the investigation of truth and sagacity, truth had sagacity enough to find it and enough bold assurance to tell it. I congratulate and envy my countrymen who may improve in your conversation," meaning when Hume was in Paris. "We are generally speaking half philosophers as we are half free. We dare neither see truth in its full light, nor unveil openly the little glimpses we discover. The abettors of superstition clip our wings and hinder us from soaring." Thus, Voltaire to Hume. There was a second letter from Voltaire to Hume dated the 24th of October 1766 from Ferney about Jean-Jacques Rousseau that was published as the pamphlet Lettre de Monsieur Voltaire à Monsieur Hume. This was part of the very public falling out between Hume and Rousseau, but that the letter was actually sent to Hume has been questioned. This exchange of letters hardly makes Hume one of Voltaire's visitors. So why is David Hume included here? He is here because, like us, he could only know Voltaire through his writings. Hume, in effect, made a virtual visit to Voltaire, and so shall we as we explore with our speakers today, the most extraordinary man of the age. And unlike Gibbon, Boswell, and Burney, we cannot immortalize our visit with selfies as we still celebrate Voltaire. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Richard. I think, to quote Boswell, your talk was both lively and most agreeable. So thank you for that. And we have about 10 minutes for questions before our break. And maybe I'll invoke my moderator's prerogative and ask the first one. And I was intrigued by this gathering of 4 people and the variety of that. How typical would they be of the sort of people who would have been interested and made the pilgrimage to see Voltaire? Is this a small self-selected group in particular, or was Voltaire such a public figure by that point that this would have been a somewhat of a normal thing to have people come to see him and worship at his feet? Or?
Yes. Yes, well, as I mentioned at some point, Voltaire had the reputation of being the hotel keeper of Europe and had over 500 British visitors during his life. So, as I say, I think it was one of those things that anybody who was embarking on the grand tour, this was one of the things that was on your list, and you tried to check it, make certain that you at least saw the great man, but if you could have conversation with him, all to the better. I have to be frank about the choice of these 4. A lot of it's rather personal. I have been I wouldn't say fan, but a friend, an acquaintance of Boswell for probably 40 years. Burney has become increasingly important to us because of the Burney Center here at McGill, and I have been working very much with Peter Saber, who unfortunately or fortunately is in Oxford at the moment and not here, and building a very extensive Burney collection, not only Frances, and that's the main focus, of course, lifetime editions of her novels, but also materials her father's own publications, material relating to the musical life during his lifetime, and other materials like that. Gibbon, again, we have quite extensive holdings of Gibbon, and if I manage to live long enough, I have some unpublished materials relating to Gibbon's library, which I hope will see the light of day in the not too distant future. And finally, of course, David Hume has been a long favorite here at McGill, and I've been directly involved. I'm not a Hume scholar at all, but I certainly know a lot about Hume bibliography and how you build Hume collections. So they were figures that had a connection with McGill, but they were also figures who actually left accounts of their visits with Voltaire, which I have shared with you today.
I believe the gentleman behind was first, and then Madam, you'll be second. Thank you.
Did these 4 writers in their accounts have any discussion of Voltaire's ideas and what they thought of them?
Well, certainly Boswell had lengthy discussions with Voltaire, and they appear primarily in his letters to his friends, and not in his journal.
Did any of them, we have no idea whether they agreed with any of his ideas or were violently opposed to some of them?
It's difficult to know in a sense. I can't say a lot about that. I think in terms of just kind of work backwards, Burney certainly was, this was an important figure, and he was just, had gone out to see where the man lived and had the chance to encounter him. He certainly thought he was a great figure. but it's possible to consider people great figures without necessarily agreeing with their ideas. As I say, Boswell certainly wanted to pin Voltaire down on his thoughts about the deity and that kind of thing, and I think there was a lot of discussion about that, but as Zaretsky says, you know, Boswell actually got the response that he didn't want, that you know, this was it. Hume, well, Gibbon, I don't think, you know, I think he was more interested in the theater actually than Voltaire's ideas. But Hume, I think, is a very interesting case, and I've thought a lot about this. Why didn't he want? I mean, he could easily have left Paris for a few days to go to Geneva to meet Voltaire, and I'm not certain. I think I sympathize with Hume. That, you know, I would prefer to regard this personage from afar. But again, Hume certainly respected Voltaire and his ideas. How much they played into him, I'm not a person who can really answer that.
Thank you.
Second.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for a stimulating presentation. I was wondering, what would Voltaire think about our media? For example, the at-issue panel on the CBC that treats politics like a horse race, who's winning and who's losing, but they never talk about issues, political issues. What do you think Voltaire would say about that?
Well, I suspect that he would be like lots of us and say, well, that's very funny, but it kind of misses the point.
I think one can almost envision a bracelet or something with the initials of what would Voltaire think. I think that would be opposed to what would Voltaire do. Do we have any? Yes, one more question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for a very lively, agreeable discussion. I would like to know, all these men met Voltaire when he was quite old and decrepit, as he called himself. Mm-hmm. Are there any encounters with him as a young man? What I got out of this, I mean, he has a wonderful sense of humor, is what I really enjoyed knowing about. But I would like to know if there are accounts of meeting him as a younger man.
Well, certainly. I mean, he spent, a couple of years at least in London in the 1720s, I believe, and I'm not familiar with other accounts of this nature, but I'm certain that there must be at least brief mentions that, you know, I've met Voltaire here or there, and other people as well. It's just I'm not aware of them.
Yes, sir. Would you perhaps go to the mic? No, go to the microphone, please. That would be wonderful, but just so we can record this. Thank you.
On that last point, I just mentioned that his famous Lettres philosophiques is being edited at the moment, and I know there is a research assistant who's trying to find a lot about what he did in London, which has perhaps not been discovered until now. So a few years down the line, that critical edition should be coming out. And could I just make two other quick points? One was that, yes, so many people visited Voltaire, but sometimes Voltaire was very annoyed that some people didn't come to visit him. I can't remember who. I think Diderot may be one example. And the other point you mentioned quite rightly at the start about celebrity culture, which we associate very much with Voltaire. I think the important point to bear in mind that, you know, Louis XIV is famous because he's the king, or Louis XV is the king, but Voltaire's made himself. Mm-hmm. And then people got interested. What does Voltaire do? What's he look like? What does he eat? You know, when you take an interest in their private lives, not just in their writings. And when people go there, then they can come away and write in their journals or write letters to friends and probably boast about their experience.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. think we have time for one last question. Yes, sir.
Well, it's something I have thought about for a long time. Voltaire received hundreds and hundreds of visitors. Most of them were just people who wanted to meet the great man. And what I imagine is that many of them would have started a conversation with Voltaire saying, I have read all your books, or that kind of thing. Now, my question is, do we have any records of some of the comments or answers he gave to that? I have read all your books. I mention this because when I was in my teens, I visited a major writer whom I very much admired. And I told him that, well, I was in my teens. I said, I have read all your books. And he said, well, isn't that a coincidence? So have I.
I would suspect that was probably the answer that they got.
Dare we ask who that was? This wit? Who was that? Who was the author?
He was a wonderful author. He lived 1898, 1970. His name was Conrado Nale Roxlo. He lived in Uruguay and in Argentina. He wrote some of the best spoofs of famous authors that I have ever read in any language. I translated 2 or 3 of them that. So to try to make them known.
Accessible.
So
Good.
it's we have here at the McGill, and there are 2 or 3 of his books.
Excellent.
So Conrado Nale Roxlo.
Thank you so much. I think it's 11 o'clock now. So what I would like to do is thank Richard once more for a wonderful time.